Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 88 of Contemplating Life. In this episode, I kick off a multipart series in which I return to the topic of religion. Now, whenever I talk about religion, I always include this disclaimer that I'm not out to convert anyone to my beliefs. As with all topics, my purpose is to educate, entertain, enlighten, and possibly inspire. But none of that includes trying to evangelize you to be a Christian or a Catholic. I'm just telling my stories. For 30 years, I taught classes to people considering converting to Catholicism. The classes were part of a program called RCIA, which stands for Rite of Christian Initiation of Adults. Note that rite is spelled R-I-T-E, not R-I-G-H-T or W-R-I-T-E. That's because the program includes a series of rites or rituals that are part of the initiation process. Recently, the program has been renamed to OCIA, for Order of Christian Initiation of Adults. I'll continue to call it RCIA because that's what we called it when I was teaching. The classes met one night per week, usually on Thursdays, beginning in late August or early September, and running a few weeks past Easter. The program's first half is just basic instruction in Christianity and the Catholic faith. And we clarify that there should be no pressure for you to join. In fact, sometimes the pastor would say to the group, "Don't tell me you're ready to join the Catholic Church. You don't yet know what the Catholic Church really is." Sometime in January, the priest would interview each participant privately and see if they were still interested in converting to Catholicism. They could continue the classes even if they didn't want to convert. But the second half of the curriculum focused more directly on preparing you to receive the sacraments of initiation: baptism, First Communion, and confirmation. These sacraments would be administered at a special ceremony the night before Easter. There were two categories of non-Catholics who attended the program. First, we have catechumens, who have not been baptized in any other Christian religion. We also have candidates. These are people who have been baptized but want to convert from some other form of Christianity to become Catholic. The program is essentially the same for both of them. The only distinction was which rituals they would participate in for their initiation. In addition to the non-Catholics who attended the program, possibly to convert, nearly half of the class participants were already Catholic. Often these were Catholic spouses, fiancés or fiancées, who were there to support their partners in their faith journey. Some attendees had converted the previous year, but wanted to come back again for a deeper understanding of what they had learned the prior year. And others were simply Catholics who wanted to update their faith. I first attended the program in 1984-85 as someone who had left the church in their late teens, but was returning to investigate whether the church was right for me. A year or two later, I began teaching some of the classes as part of our RCIA team. I'll explain later about my failing recollection as to when I actually started teaching. In this series of episodes, I'm going to dust off my old lesson plans and turn them into podcast episodes. Now, when I taught these lessons, I felt obligated to adhere to official Catholic teaching to the extent I could. However, in this series, I might diverge a bit and talk about my own personal beliefs that may not be 100% the Catholic doctrine. I'll also talk about things I've learned about theology, especially the interpretation of Scripture, that I've learned in the few years since I retired from teaching. I'll try to clarify what portions of my discussion represent genuine Catholic doctrine and where I go off on a tangent from time to time. What I'm about to present is not exactly how I would have taught it in my 30 years of service to my parish. I'm simply using my old lesson plans as an outline or a jumping off point to talk about religion in general. Before we get started, let me provide some context and background. In previous episodes, I talked about the early part of my faith journey, from my indoctrination in the Roman Catholic Church, beginning in first grade, through my eventual departure from the Church in my late teens, and my return to the Catholic Church in my late 20s. The details are in episodes 6, 7, 11, 12, 13, and 14. It's not 100% necessary to review those episodes if you haven't already heard them, but I encourage you to check them out. It gives you a deeper understanding of how I got to where I felt my faith had grown sufficiently that I was confident I could teach. Additionally, I did a series of episodes about my early ministry in the church once I returned. Most of that work I did as a member of St. Gabriel Parish Finance Committee and Pastoral Council. These topics are covered in episodes 37 through 42. It's not as necessary that you hear those episodes before we proceed, but I just thought I'd mention them here. My ministry with the Finance Committee was ongoing during the first years of teaching. Now you're probably wondering how a guy with a BS degree in computer science ended up teaching Catholic theology. So here's the backstory. In addition to that first full year of attending RCIA as a returning ex-Catholic, I also attended a variety of other adult education programs offered by my parish. The most influential and inspiring one was a series of lectures on the Catholic approach to Scripture given by Jim Welter of nearby St. Monica Parish. He called his lecture series The Ascending View. I already explained what he meant by that phrase in episode 13, but I'll cover it more in later episodes here. I was very impressed both intellectually and spiritually by Jim's work. I was particularly interested in the sections where he would share part of his personal faith journey in the context of his teaching. Whether one is teaching an adult education program, Catholic Sunday school, or a religion teacher in a Catholic parochial school, they're not called teachers. The term we use is catechist. This is defined as someone who instructs by sharing their faith. Jim taught me by example what that means. In preparation for these episodes, I tried to locate Jim Welter. His website domain has been taken over by someone else, but I found him on Facebook, and I'm trying to contact him to thank him for all I learned from his work. I always gave him full credit for teaching me much of what I know about the Catholic approach to Scripture, and one of my lessons is essentially a stripped-down and condensed version of what he taught over a series of 3 or 4 lectures. One of the questions I cannot answer is exactly when did I begin teaching? We're talking about events from 40 years ago, so my recollection is a bit fuzzy on the details. The timeline begins April 21st, 1984, when I attended the Easter Vigil service at the invitation of my friend Judy to see her husband Paul initiated into the church. They had just completed a year of RCIA classes. Attending that service was the beginning of my entry back to the church after an absence of about 9 years. Judy and Paul returned to the classes in the fall of '84, and I joined them and attended through the '84-'85 sessions. If you had asked me a few days ago when I began teaching, I would have said it was the following year in the '85-'86 sessions. But the more I think about it, I don't think I started until the following year in '86-'87. So upon deeper reflection over the past day or so, Here's what I think really happened. In the 84-85 sessions, our associate pastor, Father Conrad Cameron, taught the Introduction to Scripture lesson. He used a class participation exercise that I later incorporated into my Introduction to Scripture lesson. Then sometime, probably in 1985, I attended those lectures by Jim Welter, where I learned more about the Catholic approach to Scripture. For the 85-86 sessions, our pastor, Father Paul Landwerlen, taught the Scripture lesson, and he seemed to me to be struggling a bit with teaching the lesson. Because I was freshly armed with the abundant knowledge of the topic from Jim Welter, my reaction was, I could do better than that. So after class, I approached Father Paul and asked if perhaps I could teach the class next year, and he agreed. In the second week of the 86-87 season, I presented a lesson about the Catholic approach to Scripture, and Father Paul attended. I was happy to have him there as a backup, lest I accidentally preached some heresy or misrepresented the church doctrine. After class, he approached me with a big smile. He says, "You teach that material better than I do. We were taught all that in the seminary, but it's not something we preach or teach about on a regular basis." I'm pretty sure I simply thanked him for the compliment and for placing his trust in me, but I know inside I was thinking, yeah, I know I could do it better than you. That's why I volunteered. So anyway, that's how I got started. Let's talk about a typical year in the program after I'd been teaching a few years. Father Paul would teach the vast majority of the lessons. He was supported by a small team of parishioners known as the RCIA team. That consisted of me, my mom, Judy, and our pastoral associate, Sister Mary Timothy Cavanaugh. Father Conrad had been reassigned as the pastor of a different parish, so we only had one priest going forward. I would teach about 4 to 6 lessons per year. Sister Tim would do 1 or 2. Judy and my mom were there to help keep things organized, provide hospitality, and moral support. For many years, we would attract as many as 20 or more people to the class. We met in the parish meeting room, sitting around cafeteria tables that would seat about 6 people. The class was scheduled for 2 hours from 7 to 9 p.m., but we would take a 15-minute break in the middle for refreshments and socializing. Part of each lesson included a discussion period. The team would position themselves at different tables around the room to help facilitate the discussion and be the eyes and ears for Father to see if there was anything he needed to address with individuals or with the entire group. Often the team would sit around after class to discuss how the evening went. Sometimes these debriefing sessions ended up at Denny's for coffee and pie. As I mentioned, we started either in late August or the first week of September. The first session was just to get acquainted. Father would give an overview of the program and present an outline of lesson topics. He then invited everyone to introduce themselves. He had a brief outline of questions. Who are you? Who or what brought you here? What do you hope to gain from these sessions? He would invite the team to share first, to get the ball rolling. When it came to my question of, what brought you here? I typically said, I rode in that blue van that's out in the parking lot. I'm sure the team got sick of the joke, but it was always a big laugh from the new people. The team members, including Father, always said that we got as much or more from the sessions as did the participants. It was the example of Judy's husband and others who joined the church at the Easter Vigil that inspired me to return to the church. And seeing more and more people joining the church through the RCIA program and playing a part in their journey greatly recharged the spiritual batteries of the entire team. The following week, the lesson was a basic introduction to some core concepts about who God is and what is our relationship with Him. Both Father Paul and years later Father Larry Crawford taught a similar lesson. What follows in the remainder of this episode is based on the outline by Father Larry, with my own personal spin on the topic. Father Larry would begin with a reference to the 1966 Michael Caine film Alfie, in which the opening song asked the musical question,
"What's it all about, Alfie?"
"What's it all about, Alfie?" Father explained that's where we are. We all want to know what life is about. Why are we here? How did we get here? What is our purpose in life? By the way, I'm old enough to remember the film and the song, but many of the people in the class had no idea what he was talking about when referring to the film. Sometimes they were a bit less confused if he prefaced the reference with something like, "There was this movie years ago about a guy named Alfie, and the theme song of the movie asked the musical question, 'What's it all about, Alfie?'" That always illustrated for me that whether you're teaching a lesson or writing fiction or whatever you're presenting, you should ensure that your audience understands your cultural references. Otherwise, it doesn't work. For Father Larry, the answer was, it's all about God and our relationship with Him. That's what life is all about. And it's part of our human nature to ask these questions, and the Church has always tried to address those. Even back in first grade, when I was learning the Catholic faith from the Baltimore Catechism, the first three questions were, 1. Who made me? Answer, God made me. Question 2. Who is God? Answer, God is the Supreme Being who made all things. The third question asks, why did God make me? Answer, God made me to show forth His goodness and to share with us His everlasting life. And the fourth question was, what must I do to share in God's everlasting life? Answer, to share in God's everlasting life, we must know Him, love Him, and serve Him. Now, for a further discussion about those 4 questions of the Old Catechism, see my episode number 6. So, the process is to know God, love God, and serve God. But how do people come to know God? Here's an overview of just a few of the ways, as presented by Father Larry. Some people grow up with the knowledge of God. That probably accounts for the majority of believers. If you're raised in a religious tradition, that's your first encounter with the divine. And that's where I began. Along the way, that was insufficient for me, and I left. But I came back for my own reasons. Some people come to know God by reflecting on the course of their life. They look at their blessings. They look at the times that they survived hardship, and they conclude God's presence in their life. Some people find God's presence in nature. I once heard astrophysicist and science educator Neil deGrasse Tyson explain that when he's out in the wilderness, away from the city lights, and looking up at the stars, he can rightly describe it as a spiritual experience. But for him, that's insufficient to lead him to believe in an anthropomorphic supreme being. However, it is common to find God in nature. I've experienced some of that sense of awe or wonder that I find in nature. I've often described science as the study of the things that God made. For better or worse, this phenomenon among fundamentalist Christians leads them to try to develop a science of intelligent design. Now, while I have no problem considering God as the architect of the universe, I don't use that philosophy to justify interpreting Scripture in a manner that defies scientific fact. The fundamentalists do that in order to maintain a false view of the inspiration, inerrancy, and univocality of Scripture. Some people are convinced they've personally experienced God. I'm not talking about necessarily hearing voices from God. They simply have a transcendent spiritual experience in which they feel contact with the divine. For example, a father witnessing the birth of his children, or a woman giving birth, could be a spiritual experience when they realize the miracle that is human life, and the fact that they were able to participate in it. Perhaps surviving an accident, illness, or a disaster can lead you to the divine. As the saying goes, there are no atheists in a foxhole. These personal experiences of God are similar to the nature issue that we discussed earlier. But it doesn't always have to be an encounter with nature to instigate such feelings. Some people are helped to know God by a demonstration from reason. And there are many philosophers throughout the centuries who've attempted to prove or disprove the existence of God. The most common one is called the prime mover argument. Take any object around you, your computer, a lamp, a chair, a table, whatever. Where did that come from? The table's made from wood. Where did the wood come from? Where did the tree come from? Where did the seed from which the tree grew come from? No matter what you encounter, you can continually ask, what came before? And even scientists cannot explain what happened before the Big Bang. Ultimately, when you can go back no further, they argue that is God. In my earlier episodes about my spiritual journey, you'll see that my argument from reason is that you don't prove there's a God. You simply assume that there is a God, and then you see where that takes you. In mathematics, geometry, and logic, you always begin with something called axioms. These are unprovable truths that you accept as fact, so that you have a basis from which to build everything else. If all of mathematics is based on axioms that are taken without proof, why can we not have axioms for religion? For me, God is an axiom. I discussed this more in episode 14. Some people come to know God through their desire for perfect, unconditional love. In some respects, this also reflects my philosophy. I look at the blessings in my life, especially the people in my life, my family and friends who take care of me. And I sometimes feel unworthy to be so blessed. My only logical conclusion is that these people were put in my life by a God who loves me. And I also see it as my mission to be a blessing in their lives as well. Some people are led to God by people who love God. This is similar to being brought up by believers. However, in this case, it can occur later in life. If you associate with religious people and see the value that it brings to their lives, then you adopt new traditions to get a piece of that peace. Finally, some people simply cannot express why they believe or what God means to them. It's just beyond their capability of explaining themselves. And that's okay. God's hard to explain. I think a saying that is attributed to St. Thomas Aquinas is illustrative. He said, "To one who has faith, no explanation is necessary. To one without faith, no explanation is possible." I look to Matthew chapter 22, verse 21, where Jesus says, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's." I adapt that idea to deal with the dichotomy of faith and reason. I render unto reason that which requires reason, when I render unto God that which requires faith. Going off topic for a moment, I recently wrote a sci-fi murder mystery in which a church official is murdered. I invented a fictitious religion that claimed they could merge faith and reason. This story fits my general category of sci-fi stories that goes by the phrase, "You can't do that, but what if you could?" For me, I don't try to merge or reconcile faith and reason. I give them each their own domain. Anyway, back to God. Ultimately, what it takes to know God is experience. Now, we've already listed a variety of ways in which people come to experience and to know God. Now, it's hard to say exactly what God is or why we believe in Him. Father Crawford would say that God is wholly other. That's holy spelled W-H-O-L-L-Y, not H-O-L-Y. By definition, God is beyond human understanding. But we can talk about what we do know about God. We can discuss some of God's attributes. We can say that God is all-powerful, that He is all-knowing, all-forgiving, and unconditionally loving. But can we really understand what those things mean? Can we really experience unconditional love? That's beyond human experience. For many people, God is distant. In Jewish tradition, only Moses was able to be in the presence of God. And that's why many of them failed to accept the idea that Jesus was God in human form. It was a radical concept that God would be with us personally here on earth. But for others, their relationship with God is quite personal. The image of a divine Jesus walking the earth as one of us and calling us His brothers and sisters makes God more accessible. And people have personal relationships with God much more easily than they have with a distant God the Father sitting on a heavenly throne. The theme of the 4 lessons that I teach after this opening lesson about God is that our God is a God who speaks to us. He's revealed Himself to us in a variety of ways. In those future episodes, we'll talk about what has been revealed, how we preserve and pass on that revelation, and what we've learned by reflecting upon what has been revealed. Ultimately, most of what we know about God comes through Jesus. So, we're going to wrap things up for today. In the next episode, we'll discuss human nature. How we view ourselves as human beings affects how we see our relationship with God. We'll also discuss the concepts of good and evil, and how we use metaphors of angels and demons to discuss these concepts. Now, all of that was included in our opening lesson of the RCIA program. Remember that these weekly sessions were about 90 minutes or more. I'm going to try to keep these podcasts not much longer than 30 minutes. So it's going to take us multiple episodes to get through each lesson plan. Before we conclude, I have a bit of housekeeping. This podcast website, contemplating-life.com, we have a spam blocking software that had to be disabled because the license for that software was for non-commercial use only. Because I solicit donations and Patreon sponsors, that makes me a commercial entity in their eyes, even though I'm not making hardly any money here. I would have to be making 4 times as much to buy that software. So I've had to disable comments on the blog posts where I promote each episode. But you can still comment on Spotify, YouTube, or Facebook, and I encourage you to do so. So, as always, if you find the podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for $5 a month. You get early access to the podcast and other exclusive content. I won't in this for the money, but every bit helps. And as always, my deepest thanks to my financial supporters. I cannot express how much that means to me. If you cannot provide financial support, please post links and share the podcast so I can grow my audience. I just want more people to hear the stories. All the back episodes are available, so check those out. And if you have comments, questions, or other feedback, feel free to comment on YouTube, Facebook, or Spotify. I'll see you next time as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.